and welcome to Kankakee Podcast, where we talk about the people and places of Kankakee County. I'm Jake LaMore, and today we're diving into the world of classical music with a special guest, Sean Paul Mills. He's the artistic director and the conductor of the Kankakee Valley Symphony Orchestra. With an impressive background as both a cellist and conductor, Sean Paul has performed and led ensembles across the U.S. and Europe. He's also an educator, a passionate advocate for orchestral music, and believe it or not, he's actually a dedicated martial artist as well. We're going to talk about his journey in music, his vision for the Kankakee Valley Symphony Orchestra, and even how his experience in karate influences his approach to conducting. Welcome. And I should say, I know in our email exchanges, you didn't want to get into formalities, but Dr. Sean Paul Mills.
That's correct.
So,
yeah. My parents didn't give me that name. It's a title that was, given to me by a university later.
That was earned.
It wasn't earned. Sure,
or was it?
That's true. It wasn't given. I did earn it.
Okay,
that is
I was
accurate.
going to say, was it one of those honorary situations? I didn't think so.
No.
I thought
there was blood, sweat, and tears involved.
Yeah,
and more tears probably than anything else.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, your cello was probably soaked. And you probably had to get a new one. Yeah. It's just soaked in so much blood and tears.
Actually, it kind of works the other way with violin family instruments. I had to get an older one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah, of course. So you've got an extensive background in both performance and conducting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, what first drew you to music and specifically the cello?
All right. Well, I like that story because it wasn't myself.
Okay.
I wasn't drawn to it particularly. As a typical 7, 8, 9-year-old child, I did all the things everybody else did, ran around outside. I grew up North Coastal California, so I was able to get outside and climb trees and do all the things that kids at that age do. And when my parents were thinking about things to have me do other activities other than just running amok, that my mother wanted me to have some music. And I'm both my parents, obviously, but my mother was sort of the primary instigator, as I like to say.
You meaning that she was adamant that
she was the advocate that I learned something.
Music. Yes.
And
usually it seems like it's piano, right?
And wisely enough, that's actually where it started. You're right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, think about it too. Of all the instruments that one could choose, it's probably is the least egregious of all of them. That you push something down and it makes the sound for you. It finds the right note. And compared to, cello, where you're having to grope around in the dark, essentially, trying to find out.
Seriously.
And develop your ear.
Right. It's not a guitar. There's no dots.
There's no frets. There's no dots.
No
there's nothing. And at least with the piano, some expert comes in and tunes it. Or now you just have a chip inside everything is tuned naturally for you.
I didn't even think about that. They do have those nowadays, don't
so
they?
You don't have to worry about it on an electronic keyboard. It just is.
Yeah.
But it gives you that initial instruction into rhythm and melody and harmony and all of those elements that go into making any music. And so I started with that. A couple of years on piano, and then of course, 4th, 5th grade years roll around. In our school district, 1 year was brass and woodwinds, the next year was strings.
Oh, interesting.
And so by the time
a lot of school districts like that?
In California at that point it was, where the focus on 1 year was, like I said, the woodwind, brass, and percussion side of things. And then the next year would be strings. And that may have been mostly just smaller districts. I don't know what LA
I'm
or
sure
San
you've learned
Francisco.
in the Midwest that's not really how we do things.
Right. No, I have learned that.
And that was probably like, oh, interesting. I'm sure you were fascinated to learn that.
So my mother, again, we had spent some time in Colorado when my father was doing his doctoral work there, and had seen the Greeley Philharmonic just northeast of Denver. And she had gotten interested in, loved the sound of the cello. And so, we started talking about, well, I'd like you to consider playing another instrument now. And so cello just made sense. Now, admittedly,
were you attracted to it, though?
I will tell this. Well, so I don't know, because the first day when you walk in, you go into the cafetorium or whatever, the combination of auditorium and cafeteria and gym. Yep. So with gym, the cafetorium,
or
whatever the three put together form.
Yeah.
Sit on the table where you're used to eating lunch, and the music teachers have these instruments out for you, and you're looking at them, and you really have two things going on in my case. And maybe I was just a really late bloomer, but case number one was I could tell what the violin was. I had no idea what the other ones were that were out. And number two was I didn't even know how to spell cello. I remember filling out the form with CHELLOW because, that seemed like that must be how it would spell because that's what it sounded like.
Yeah. So. But it's literally spelled like Jello. Exactly.
With the C instead of the J. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which isn't even the name of the instrument.
No, that's right. What is the name? I forgot about that.
It's actually violoncello, not violoncello, but violone. Violone was bass, essentially a bass instrument. And cello is a diminutive term. It means small.
Okay.
So it's a small bass.
So, yeah.
Violoncello.
It's been a long time, and I don't even remember all the variations, but like there is a difference between a violin and a cello, right? Or is a cello a violin?
No, it's not. I mean, they're from the same family.
Right, obviously.
Same construction, same patterns. One's more inflated. Obviously, you sit with the cello versus the violin, which is strapped under the chin.
Yeah.
And then there's the viola too,
Right.
And they're all tuned differently.
Yeah.
The viola and cello actually have more in common because of their strings and their tuning than they do with the violin.
Yeah. How many combinations? So you've got, the viola, cello, violin. What else?
And so,
are there more than that?
Well, there's this tendency in music, as you know, with choirs particularly, to have groups of four.
Right.
So you have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass members. And so if you think about saxophones, you tend to have that. If you think about the woodwind section, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, you have that same combination of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass sound. So the only thing that we're missing, violin, viola, cello, is bass.
Bass, okay.
Which actually...
Actual bass.
If you actually look at the bass, so you realize that generally they don't look quite the same. And that's because they actually do come from a different lineage, but they've been adopted into the violin family.
Yeah.
And they're not even tuned the same way as the others are.
No.
So we have... But, I don't know if that's one of those don't tell anyone moments or it's one of those really great little come up to me at a concert and I'll give you a free season pass if you could tell me the difference.
Honestly, I'm a geek when it comes to stuff like that. I love learning all the differences and the variations between the two. And you telling me, well, actually, they're not really from the same family, but one we just kind of adopted. And then,
exactly.
it just, go on from there. So, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but to get further into it, your education spans several universities.
Right.
And, with a focus on both performance and conducting. How did your studies shape your approach to leading an orchestra?
Oh, wow. How much time do we have? This is 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts?
Yeah. I mean, I know we could talk forever. But I would just love to know a little bit of your university background and then even just how you wound up in Europe as well. Yeah. I'm sure one leads into the other.
Oh, yeah. We can probably make it, or even if it didn't, we can make it sound like it did. So that's all right. It's at some point in high school, I think it was, that I started realizing I really enjoyed playing the instrument and seemed to have enough facility on it that, people were encouraging me to consider music as a degree area. And so, when you do go into music as a discipline at the college level, that there are certain courses that are just within the curriculum. And so aside from just playing the instrument, of course, you're having to take theory classes and oral skills, listening classes, history courses, formal analysis, learning about the structures of music, even composition courses. And one of the sets of classes that was required as an undergraduate at the University of Oregon was conducting. And so we had to take instrumental conducting, we had to take choral conducting. And as I worked my way through that sequence, discovered that, again, I was told, because, I was still focused very much on being a cellist. I was going to play in chamber music and in symphonies and maybe do solos once in a while.
I was going to say, you were going to be the solo, the world famous.
I knew I wasn't
cello.
going to be Yo-Yo Ma, but I knew I was really interested in being in that college learning setting, college, university, private academy sort of setting. And so my focus was really kind of lasered on that. But then I kept getting told by these conducting teachers that you have a very graceful or natural way or a really clear way of communicating information. You should really consider, and then you can finish the sentence from there. And so that just kind of stayed with me through the undergraduate and graduate process. And I still stayed focused, of course, on playing and played professionally in some groups while in grad school and taught simultaneously, which one can do when you're doing doctoral work.
Yeah.
Because once the coursework is done and you're writing your dissertation and doing your recitals, you have a little bit of free time to teach and do other things. Like all musicians, we're all a little insane.
Yeah.
And burn the candle at both ends and the middle. Just
Man, you're just hitting the nail on the head again and again today. Before we were recording, you said something to me, or I was talking about having the camera in focus, and you're like, well, nothing's really in. You said something about not being in focus or whatever. I'm just like, man, I feel that today. It's like, that's exactly how I feel.
Everything's a blur.
Everything's a blur.
Everything's a blur.
No, but conducting looks like it's so easy, leading an orchestra or a band. It looks like it's so easy. And I know this is, a tad bit off subject, but, I have to share this story. So when I was in junior high band, our band director was absent for a string of days or whatever, or at least one day. And there was one day where we had a sub, but they weren't necessarily like in the arts. They weren't.
You had the PE teacher.
Something. I don't remember what it was. And so I don't remember how this took place, but somehow it came up to me to try to lead the band that day in our whatever songs we were learning. I can't remember off the top of my head what they were. And, it looks like, you're just waving around the baton like this is easy, right?
Yeah, right.
No. It's so much hard. It's so much hard. Granted, I was a
You'd
kid.
Seen Fantasia. You just swung that thing around in the air and things happen.
I mean, if Mickey Mouse can do
That's
it,
right.
Yeah. But eventually it gets to that point where it looks so easy. And that's obviously where you're at in your...
Well, you're absolutely right that there are some elements of it that really are. I mean, you think about it, that the patterns that we are taught for the right hand, which are essentially the meter, are pretty much predetermined ones that have, over the span of centuries now, been agreed upon by musicians, that one means this thing and you do it in a certain combination of down, left, right, up, and that defines 4/4 or defines 2/4 or 2/2, or just simply up and down defines 1. Whether it's a waltz and it's a little slower or if it's really fast. But so that part of it really is pretty simple, that if you can at least learn the pattern and learn how to recreate it in a space that people understand it, that is the easy piece of it. But then there's all the rest of it. And
right. Well, I think of like spinning plates. You're literally having to spin, and the plates being all the different sections of the orchestra. They all have to go. They all have to be spinning at the same time, and it's your job to make sure that.
I like that much better than what I usually tell people. I tell people I do air traffic control for musicians.
That's pretty accurate too.
Well, the problem is though, when planes collide, the consequences are far worse than breaking a plate or two. So
yes, that's very true.
Maybe I'll take the plates over the airplanes.
No,
instead.
That's what I think of. I think of spinning plates, or and they all have to be spinning.
But you're right, there are a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
The old days, the internal workings of a clock or a watch, with everything turning and rotating and moving in a certain way. And if it doesn't move just quite right, the watch loses time or stops. But you're absolutely right. And so there is, we see the final product usually as an audience member. So we go to the Chicago Symphony or San Francisco, or we go to even the band that we like to hear play, right? We go see Sting in concert, and we see the finished product. We don't see what really about 90% of my work actually is, or Sting's work, or whoever it is. It's the lead, right? That's all really the conductor is. It's the director or the leader of the group. In the sense that people say, okay, we want you to give us some guidance as to what to do here. And you leave a lot of it to them, of course, too, based on their level of experience and skill. But that other 90% is where things are discussed and tried and workshopped, and all these other elements that are far more like an art project in some ways, or making a book come to life as a theater piece or a film, where all the blocks have to be placed in a certain order in order to make things happen.
Yeah, it's funny when you think about it, because you come to that concert performance, you perform that song that's maybe it's 5 to 10 minutes long.
Yeah, maybe it's 55 minutes
maybe
long.
It's 50, maybe it's 55 minutes long. But it doesn't account for all the hours that you spent.
It's the iceberg.
Yeah.
You see, just like the Titanic, you see the tip. It's not too soon for a Titanic joke, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay, all right.
It's not too soon.
But, you see the tip, and you realize now that there is something below that tip.
Yeah,
but,
and it's much bigger.
Of course, they obviously did once they did, but yeah, it is much bigger, and there is so much more that goes into any performance.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't matter if you've got a little jazz trio or if you have a full symphony orchestra of 75 or 80 individuals, or a musical theater piece with maybe a cast and crew of 150, that it's all the same, that so much of the work is below the surface that the audience never sees.
Right. And this is your time of recording this. Mm-hmm. This is your second season?
First
or is it your
full one.
First full one.
I came in January of last year.
Okay. First, what brought you to Illinois? If you grew up in California, ended up in Denver, or somewhere in Colorado. Maybe
that was when I was still young.
That was when you were young. But how did you end up in the Midwest?
So initially, I wound up in the Midwest because of graduate studies. That we typically, I guess I shouldn't say typically. There are two routes a musician can go if they're going to go past, say, the bachelor's degree in music, and one of them is to do a substantial change and go to a school of thought that's completely different about your instrument than the one you've been growing up with. I chose the other route, which is to stay within that school of thought. And so my teacher at the University of Oregon had studied at Eastman School of Music under a cellist named Luigi Silva, who had died, I think, in the 1950s. Let's just put 50s on there. I don't remember his actual dates. And the teacher at the University of Iowa had also studied under Luigi Silva. So I would have gotten two different perspectives on the same aspects of cello performance, how the hand is shaped and used, the philosophy about when to make huge shifts up and down the instrument versus trying to stay in one grouping of the hand, how the bow is used, how music's interpreted even. And so when I looked around for schools, there were 3 or 4 former students of Silva's in the U.S., University of Arizona, Wisconsin-Madison, University of Iowa. And so I applied, and Iowa had the best option. That had a good assistantship, opportunities for me to play and teach. So it kind of fit everything I wanted. And so I wound up moving from Oregon to Iowa, which, yes, you're going to ask the question, was a bit of culture shock.
Oh, my gosh. I can only imagine.
I will tell you, it's the only time in my life, though, where I've moved somewhere and somebody's, where are you from? You have an accent.
It's funny you say that because, my wife is originally from the south side of Chicago. And even just coming down here, people tell her that she has an accent.
Right.
Even though she doesn't really have that typical South Sider accent. Maybe there's some words, but then she does make fun of me for the way I say Chicago, instead of Chicago,
Yeah. Soft versus hard. Yeah, I hear you. So, no, I know.
Gosh,
that was so funny though to get there and then have somebody tell you, you have an accent. Where are you from? And I'm thinking, well, it's not like I'm talking about packing the cat. So,
right. It is.
I mean, really?
It is so funny. Sometimes it's like you do come to a different country, but you're still in the United States, but it feels like a whole new place.
Well, this is a big country.
Yeah.
So, I've been around some of it too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you've been all over the place.
But anyway, I got married while I was in graduate school. And my wife and I decided, we both were from the West Coast. We decided, well, we'd really like to stay west of the Mississippi and head back towards family. So we decided whoever had the better job offer first, we'd move to that location. And so she actually was offered a job at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. And so we headed out there. And then by the usual process, I found things to do, including light opera company and some symphonic conducting out there. And an opportunity arose for her. We moved to Oregon. Opportunity arose again. We moved to Indiana. And then we moved to Illinois.
Okay. Wow.
And that's because, and I just have to drop it now, might as well say it, that she's the 14th president of Aurora University.
Wow. That's incredible. Congratulations.
Indeed. Thank you.
That's amazing.
So as any good spouse does, and especially a musician, because you know this story too, is we go someplace, we look around and go, oh, okay, I know what they need, and I can fill that need.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Absolutely.
Though actually here I didn't do that. So much.
So, right. How did the opportunity come to be part of the Kankakee Valley Symphony Orchestra?
It was a little bit circuitous to get there. When we first got here, the University of St. Francis was hiring a director of orchestral activities for the Joliet Symphony, which they housed there. It's what we call a town and gown ensemble, meaning that it's a combination of university students and then community members that come in. And I had been conducting them for a few months, and this opportunity arose, and they knew of me through the JSO. And so several people contacted me and came down and talked to them a bit, and they decided, hey, let's give this guy a try.
Yeah.
So it was, essentially by word of mouth and reputation, rather than the more traditional route that, when an orchestra has time or an ensemble has time, they do a job announcement and they bring in a lot of candidates, and it could be a 2 or 3 year process. This one was very much more about, we need someone now.
Yeah.
Can you help us?
Right. And I mean, your predecessor was, his name is skipping my mind.
Alan Dennis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
He was there for a while.
Almost 38 years, I think it was. Yeah.
Long time.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, you coming into the position, I mean, is quite I'm sure you felt like you had some big shoes to fill, considering someone that you're coming in after was there for 38 years.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's just such a long time.
There's so much history and so much of a collective knowledge or memory of your predecessor. Really, no matter where you go, unless the predecessor only lasted a few months or a season in that respect. And yeah, you always do find yourself wondering, what am I replicating that either was a positive or a negative that might have come before me? Because, I don't have any knowledge of what happened before me. I only know what I do and how I do things. And so we're always trying to be cautious about not making mistakes and not replicating situations that might not have been positive ones, and wanting to replicate ones that were positive ones.
Oh,
by
absolutely.
All means. And so, I think the first 6 months to a year, that honeymoon period, is always really important to get a lay of the land and a feel for things.
So you're still sort of in that period now?
I think I'm out of it now, based on some conversations.
Oh, gosh. The symphony orchestra is not a town and gown. It is literally just its own thing. There's no university attached to it.
It's a separate nonprofit corporation, an association. Yes. But it does, and we do, I'll use we since I am a part of it, we are really trying to make sure that we are as integrated into this community as possible. Orchestras have, especially now, have some difficulty. There are a number of what we'll call regional orchestras scattered around the U.S. that have music directors that will even bring in university students of theirs from hundreds of miles away to fill the ranks. And exclude community members in the process. And that's kind of a current issue that we're always focused on, is how do we create the best possible ensemble and keep it as localized as we can or regionalized as we can.
So does Olivet come into play at all then?
It does.
Okay.
So we have some faculty who are in the orchestra. We also have some students, particularly in the string section, that we audition or use recommendation from their faculty members to bring in. And then the rest of the ensemble is indeed community members, as well as a few regional people. And of course, it's hard not to be that way I won't say isolated, but in the sense that we're not in the actual suburban district, if you will, of Chicago. We have a little more distance to travel.
Yep.
And if you need a really specific instrument or one that takes a great skill set to master, because of some difficulty involved in it, then you do have to go a little further sometimes. So we have players coming up from Bloomington to play, and down from pretty much the heart of Chicago as well. A few folks that travel from the Indiana border, and then that conductor shows up from Aurora.
It's just incredible to hear, how all of this works. Because I guess, on a day-to-day, it's not something I sit down and think about. Like, well, how does all this get put together?
Yeah, and I don't know if that's something you want everyone to be thinking about anyway. I mean, I would love you to go to a concert, sit in your seat, hear the pre-concert discussion about the music, the composer, meet the guest artist, learn a little bit about what you're going to be experiencing, and then just experience the music rather than sitting there going, I wonder if the 3 inches of snow caused any difficulty for the people to get here. Is the cold weather affecting the instruments?
Yes.
Those are interesting things to know about, but I'd like to think of them as extra musical or perhaps extra situational. And you and I can talk about them.
Yeah, we can talk about them.
But I don't want some in the audience, chewing their fingernails down to nubs because they're concerned about something that isn't part of the concert itself.
So how does it work with, I know it's a not-for-profit, but how does that, do players get paid? Or
they do in this orchestra, yes.
Okay.
Not all orchestras do. Some are full-time, like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, where they're paid a set salary that's within union or whatever representation they have locally within that scale system, with or without benefits, depending on the orchestra. And there are others that are per service, and that means you're paid a certain amount depending on where you sit in that section.
Oh,
and that's essentially how the KVSO is set up.
Oh, okay.
Is a per service orchestra.
So if you're first chair, then you would
your
make
scale is a little bit
second
different than
chair.
somebody who doesn't have responsibility of leadership or providing certain elements like bowings or recommended fingerings or things like that. Is
it still set up that way, or
we are? Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Gotcha. And then you have others like the Joliet Symphony I was talking about earlier, where it, as a town and gown, it's all volunteer. People just show up for 6 or 7 rehearsals and then do concerts, and it's all on them.
And I'm sure, just like anything else, there's some really cool things about that structure, and then there's some really cool things about, like the KVSO structure,
That's right.
So, I mean, it does, I'm sure, just to kind of show up, volunteer, do your own thing has some really just kind of cool aspects to it. But then I'm sure there's some limitations as well.
And that's true with anything, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we can think about it if we equate it to the baseball or softball league in the summer.
Oh, yeah.
You get those guys that show up and they're really good players, and you've got the guys out there that are, picking the daisies apart in the field. I mean, wait, that's Little League. But I mean, you have all of that, the well-intentioned as well as those who really are very skilled at something. But there's a joy in that too. But you're right. But there are the pros and cons that go with it.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now with the KVSO? I mean, it's obviously an institution that has been here for several decades.
57th season this year.
Yeah, exactly. It's beat that SNL.
That's right. I had not thought about it.
Yeah, they're at 50.
Right.
We're at 57, huh? Right. Not that SNL.
I'll have to give Lauren Michaels a call and rub it in.
Yeah. But yeah, there's got to be some challenges with that, especially when, I just think about how not even all of our schools have orchestra programs.
Sure.
Most of them don't.
Right. I
mean, there's maybe 1 in the county that have an orchestra program. So, I mean, that's...
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's the fact that increasingly things like music programs, art programs, theater, all have wound up becoming extracurricular activities. And that means then that the demand for teachers is lesser than it was, let's just say 4 or 5 decades ago, where every school might have had 2 music teachers that came through during the week for elementary. And then middle school might have had some full-time band, orchestra, choir people, and high school the same. Now we're looking at programs where maybe there's one that goes from school to school and is there in the mornings at some schools and afternoons at others after classes have adjourned. And so, there is that concern about, where is the next generation of players, next generation musicians coming from? And I think you also have that concern generally too with just the structure that has to support. I mean, you would think about it, it's not just the orchestra. I mean, it's all about the orchestra because that is the ensemble. But what about the behind the scenes? Who's ushering, ticket taking, who's doing social media, who is making sure that the bylaws, if it's an organizational structure of some sort, are being adhered to?
Right.
I mean, is there a board of directors? Is there a president? Is there an executive director? I mean, there are all these moving pieces again that come into play that are that other part of the iceberg that we don't see as an audience member, that have to be in play. And these are generally volunteers. Boards.
Right. They're all
board of
volunteers,
directors generally are volunteers. I mean, you do
Right.
have occasionally an executive director or some office staff, but with even the largest orchestras, you still have these board members and others that if somebody decides or becomes ill or decides they're unable to do something, someone else has to pick up that piece, and you have to start being concerned about that.
Right. Now, of all the orchestras and just groups you've been involved in, what do you find so unique about the Kankakee Valley Symphony Orchestra that you have not seen in any of the other groups you've been a part of?
You might have to keep asking me other questions, and I'll come back
You're
to
gonna
that
think
one.
about that one.
I'm not saying that we're not unique in some capacity. I mean,
Yeah.
but there are some characteristics about musicians and people that want to see an ensemble, an organization survive that are identical or similar, at least, from state to state, region to region. And so it's hard to say that that's a really unique function, but I love the fact that here we are in a community this size. I mean, it's Tri-City area that is relatively small compared to, say, Aurora at 290,000 or something.
Yep, much bigger.
And so there's that uniqueness of having a full symphony and the ability to staff it with people who don't travel really all that far. I mean, let's just say the furthest distance out is an hour and 25, 30 minutes, Chicago's only an hour.
Right, well, you're talking about Bloomington.
Bloomington North.
Yeah.
Let's say Aurora for me is about an hour and a half.
Right.
So it's about the same.
Yep.
So let's just say in that more confined geographic space, but to have people who are dedicated to be involved in this orchestra and come from those distances to share their skills with this community, and then to have a community that's supportive of that has been supportive of it for almost 6 decades now.
Yep.
Is really phenomenal, because we do see a lot of groups start and then fail, or start and then revise who they are and what they do. And maybe that speaks a little bit too to one of the unique elements is that a lot of orchestras have tried over the last couple of decades, particularly to modernize. And I don't think they really know what that means. I don't know that I really know what that means.
I was about to ask you, what does that look like to modernize?
What that's looked like for a lot of groups is to start to drop away some of the more traditional programming and focus more on newer artists. So Seattle Symphony is a good example. They brought hip hop to the symphony and started doing collaborative projects like that, playing live music along with movies.
Yes,
like Star Wars. Chicago Symphony does that.
Does a lot of that.
Yeah, and a lot of them are doing that now. San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, LA, they've all done that sort of thing. The movement towards what I've called pops concerts at some point in the past seems to be.
Well, that's more like when I think of the Chicago Symphony playing with the movies and stuff. I think it's just like you're aligning yourself with like pop culture, like directly to get people into the door. And which, I mean, you guys do that a little bit. Right. Sometimes maybe the theme for a concert is geared towards something that's pop culture driven.
Sure, yeah.
Right?
And it's we don't do as much because, and the other piece of it too is you're looking at an orchestra that is in a major metropolitan area that has 40 weeks, and I mean 40 weeks of concerts. The CSO has 3, 4, sometimes 5 concerts in a week. Whereas we have one concert every other month or so, right. 5 regular ones a year. Yes. We don't really have that flexibility, or should we necessarily be that experimental? Because if we go the wrong way with an experiment, that pretty much could end the entire season. Yeah. If enough people don't enjoy it, word gets out, the next thing you know, your next audience is smaller than the size of the orchestra. But
I'm sure there's some things that maybe you're wanting to try that's different than the orchestra's done before, right?
I mean, there was some research done and by orchestra musicians in the last couple of decades that have indicated that, if anything, audiences are a little bit put off by this attempt to be too popular and too modern, instead of thinking more about what are ways that we could integrate other arts or other elements of society into the experience. So instead of, say, instead of moving this essentially, we're working with a 19th century ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say that because all these instruments pretty much are formalized by the 19th century. We add a few new ones in here and there, but most of the ones that we're familiar with are already in existence by the time the 20th century rolls in. Yep. So late 1800s, we're set. Why try to play, EDM with an acoustic ensemble, because that kind of defeats the electronic piece of it, and mix these things, sure, maybe as a one-off or as a special event occasionally isn't a bad thing to do, but to try to do full concerts of this or to completely reshape what a symphony orchestra is has actually proven to backfire more often than it has to promote advancement. What a lot of groups have found is the integration of other opportunities, like perhaps some collaboration with an art gallery. Okay. Where there's maybe an opening of some artwork, and then the orchestral program that happens either before or after that opening somehow ties into that concept. Pieces that are related to artworks of some sort, or define or depict, I should say, artistic activities like painting or sculpture or visiting a certain location in the world that's known for those things. Bringing in unusual guest artists that aren't necessarily going to make sounds while they perform with the orchestra. I had a painter paint live with an orchestra recently.
Oh, that's so cool.
And create the work while the music was being performed, so that the colors that were used, the shapes that were derived on the canvas, were part of what was being heard.
I would go see that.
Yeah, and I love what you said, because you would go see that. We go to see and hear music, but we go to see art.
Right.
Now you have both of these together.
Yes.
And so it's that idea of what are some things that we can do that would blend some of these disciplines together. And then there's also just the simplicity of, if you go to the symphony, you get a reduced dessert at your favorite restaurant. Take your ticket stub in, and it becomes then more of a package of, it's not just I have to go to this concert and do this thing, but now I can have a meal. I can take somebody that I like to that. My wife and I can have a date night. We can go to the symphony afterwards. We can have a lovely meal, dessert, whatever it may be, and we're seeing that as another way that many orchestras are actually reversing a trend from lower audiences.
Okay.
And of course, there's the argument that this kind of media that we're on right now also has been a little bit problematic for us. Orchestras have switched to streaming concerts, and the audiences went down. Surprise. If I can sit at home and watch it on, whatever, either a projection or a very large screen TV, I lose the feeling of the space, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the other things that you encounter when you walk into a performance space.
But there's some that have gone to just streaming only?
Or at least a combination of streaming and live.
Okay.
Pandemic time, we did do a lot of streaming like that, empty halls and lots of cameras set up. But, So it's always, there's this constant need to decide, how do we move forward and to guess what maybe the next thing should be for a symphony orchestra. So back to that original question. Though. Sorry, I kind of went way out there.
No, you're fine, because ultimately, I feel like that's got to be something on top of people's minds all the time, just with, especially being so far in, the KVSO, talking 6 decades.
Yeah.
It's a long time to keep going with it. Something where a world is ever changing.
Right, exactly. And that's actually what my point was, I was going to make too, is the fact that 6 decades ago, it wasn't uncommon for children and families to go to a symphony concert. If we're talking about the 1960s, we're talking that we're just on the heels of the Beatles and Elvis, and not really the birth of rock and roll so much. It was a little bit earlier, but that idea that this kind of dual modality starts to develop, where the popularity of things like rock bands and these opportunities, actually in general, is kind of an explosion of genres happened, and an explosion of alternative venues to the traditional concert hall developed and really took off. And we are actually blessed and cursed simultaneously with just, shall we just say, a plethora of options. There's just too much out there.
There's a lot to choose from.
And so, when I teach a music history class at a university and the students come in and they have no clue who Beethoven and Mozart are, it really doesn't surprise me.
No.
because the collective, again, that collective memory, that collective knowledge that we have, get your Spotify account out and just put a word in, and how many things pop up and how many different genres are represented.
So many.
And so the hardest thing for an orchestra now, essentially, is to convince people, I guess that's probably a good word to use, is to convince people the merit of, or the merits of, knowing something about the symphony orchestra and attending, and how to enjoy that experience. Because, come on, we've all seen the symphony orchestra in video, right? TV programs, movies, whatever it may be. And it looks like it's a really stale thing for a bunch of people with a lot of this other color that I have in my hair. And it's a certain class of people that have to be there. And you've got to sit on your hands, and you can't make a sound because the conductor will shush you, or somebody next to you will shush you.
Mm-hmm.
All of these stigmas that are attached to this process when they didn't used to exist. This was one of the major forms of entertainment for hundreds of years.
And it's wild to think that to us now, just because of all the options we have.
And now somehow it's been put way up here. And yet the pieces that are written by these composers are really written for the exact same reason that, well, who do we want to name? Lady Gaga, that Michael Bublé, that Frank Sinatra, I'll go back a little further, that Huey Lewis, the Moody Blues, that, you can name all of these artists, Dizzy Gillespie, work your way back through history, all the same motivations. They want to tell stories about the human condition. That's all that symphonic composers were doing. They just happened to choose to do it a lot of the time without voices, with just instruments, so that your imagination was allowed to take it wherever it wanted to go. The soundscape you were encountering drew you to wherever.
Now that we're talking about that, what are some of the pieces that the symphony does play? Is everything... is it from the, 18th century and far, far back, or
no?
Is it just kind of all over the place? Are there new pieces, like brand new spanking new pieces you're playing?
And the answer is yes, there are. That one of my favorite activities actually about being the artistic director or music director, if it's named differently in different orchestras, is the fact that I get to look at the lay of the land and can pick pieces that fit together somehow on each concert, so that if I have a soloist that says I want to do this particular work, then I can start thinking about, okay, what are some things that are sort of related to that create a full meal for the audience, something that will not just be the same sounds over and over again, the same tempos, the same modalities, but things that would be a rich kind of look at a tapestry almost of 3, 4, 5 different pieces of music that may all really go together, even though they've never been together before.
It sounds like program. It almost sounds like you're putting together an album for each concert.
You're curating essentially 5 different albums a year, or 6, or however many concerts you're doing, right? And a good example is, so in our next concert, which is coming up in April, we're doing a newer work that just premiered about 3 years ago called Illuminare. Essentially illuminate, and it is about using the composer's living. Elaine Hagenberg, she's actually I think out in Iowa. She's somewhere in the Midwest.
In Iowa,
thinking about I have to think for a moment. Kansas, Iowa, somewhere west of Illinois.
Okay.
And, to work for chorus and orchestra, it uses things like the piano, which isn't a traditional orchestral instrument, but the harp's involved as well, which sort of is, at certain times in the history of the orchestra, with, like I said, the chorus and soloists. And this work, as its resource, essentially, its source material, takes texts from everything from the Quran and the Bible to poetry, and talks about the journey from dark to light, which we all experience at different times in our life, whether it's the loss of a loved one, or it's just simply our look at our position in life, where we've had our hard times, where we've had our good times. So she brings this in this piece of music, which is new music. It has some new sounds to it. It's not maybe one of those where it feels like fingernails on a chalkboard, or just noises at all. It's tuneful, it's beautiful, and it's in multiple languages. So we have all these interesting elements combined. And so I pick pieces that surround that aren't necessarily new. In fact, I picked a piece by Brahms, which is a set of variations, which essentially is the way that we interpret life too, right? Because I can have a situation happen to me and how I react to it varies every time I experience something like that. And on the other side of the piece, we're doing a symphony by Sibelius that also reflects sort of this movement from, if you will, winter to spring, from dark to light.
Oh, I like that.
Or from rest. I won't call it death, but from rest, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That
I do like
all
this
the way
theme,
to blooming. So that thematically it all works together, even though you would never necessarily have thought of those three pieces on that program trying to do that. And then to add to that, I have a visual artist, a photographer, coming down from Chicago who specializes in black and white photography, landscapes.
Okay.
So she captures darkness and light photographically. So we're going to have this concert then that picks all of these elements in the hopes that what happens is those that really want symphonic music for its own sake have that. Those that are intrigued by light and how music can portray light, who are more visually oriented, have the photographer. Those that like newer music and like singing have the choral work. There's a little something for everyone in the program that way. Instead of it saying, okay, we're just going to do Mozart and Beethoven.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
And I'm sure that's kind of like, that's what you're trying to head towards more, as putting those, and that's, again, probably why you have the title of artistic director. It's because you're trying to combine the multiple forms of art, music, not just orchestra.
Dance, whatever else makes
Sure, I was going to say dance fits right into that too.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, and it's just finding ways. And again, it's not like I'm not out here fishing. I'm not trying to see what I can catch.
Yeah.
But it's the idea that, instead of continuing to do the same thing, this is the old Benjamin Franklin quote, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a changing outcome. Well, instead of doing that in some expectation that, if I play Beethoven, they will come. That's a Field of Dreams quote, sorry. I'm a baseball fan here too, but don't ask me about Cubs White Sox.
Oh, don't worry.
But
I won't.
But you can. I just want to answer. But I mean, it does really come down to this thing of looking at it and going, I don't want to keep doing what's been done. We can do some of that, but to think somehow that by doing that same thing over and over and over again, sooner or later we will convince. There's that word again, right? Yeah. Convince the audience? No, you have to find that sweet spot. Interesting things for enough people that will draw them, whatever word you want to use, into.
Especially if it's something out of the norm. I think combining all those elements, definitely will attract some different people. Some people that maybe never thought about going before are like, that actually sounds kind of interesting.
And there are a couple of pieces in here that I would like to unpack at least. And one of them is the fact that, like we were saying earlier, that there's this stigma about how you have to behave and be when you come to a concert. Why? Why did that develop? I mean, I often tell people this is part of the problem. That when the recording industry began and there was this desperate need for as much silence as possible, and they were playing into those huge, the gramophone headed microphones, that there became sort of this instantaneous need for silence and a certain, I don't know what you want to call it, respectfulness for the music that caught on. And then a bunch of tyrant conductors came along that then shushed audiences or had ushers
escort
them out if they didn't follow or obey certain rules. And even I've been in concerts where someone has clapped in between movements and the conductors turned and glared at them. It wasn't me.
It's not going to be you.
And I don't glare either. So I mean, I might glare, but not for that reason. But it's just, do you want to do that? Do you want to essentially go to school to hear music? I mean, and have the wrath of the teacher on you? Right. No, I mean, we want to go out and enjoy ourselves. And so one of the things that I'm really hopeful that we start to message more, and it's not just the KVSO, but I want the KVSO to message this too, and we're trying to do that, and I think we're succeeding, is that if you're wearing jeans and a T-shirt and you come to the concert, wonderful, great. Do it.
Yeah.
No problem with that.
Here.
You do not have to dress up to go to a concert. If you want to dress up to go to a concert, go for it. It's fine. It's just like choosing to go to a fancy restaurant and whether or not you want to dress it. We're not going to stop you at the door and say you have to wear this coat and this tie. Otherwise, we're not letting you in. That's not going to happen.
It's not the country club.
I'm more like the waiter at the restaurant in New York that has the scissors ready to cut your tie and admonish you for how bad the pattern is, because I'd rather you be as comfortable and entertained and enjoy the process as possible. And so, breaking that barrier is one of the ones that I really hope that not just here, but generally we can do.
Yeah.
And help people understand that the orchestra is not a frightening thing. Right. And if you clap when you're not supposed to, it's okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
I'm not making a professional recording. And if I was, we'd just close the building down anyway. So.
Yeah, you wouldn't be there, right? Yeah, no one would be allowed if you're doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know this could go on forever. Just because you're such an interesting guy, and hilarious too. But anything else real quick about KVSO that you want to?
I just want to make sure. I think I made the point.
I think
pretty much that we really just want people to have that comfort of coming and hearing a concert, experiencing what it's like. There's such a different, and there's such a different dynamic to being in the room when the music's being performed.
Yeah, I mean, you can feel, what I like is feeling the vibrations right in your chest. That's my favorite.
I mean, it's really visceral. We've all been in the car and felt our chest start to vibrate, and we've thought, oh no, am I having a coronary event? And then the guy with the subwoofer who's playing something that boom comes by. Mm-hmm. That's what it's like being in a symphony concert. Yes. And it's even better when you're actually on the stage. I mean, I have what is the best seat in the house.
Yeah.
Not only do I get to turn my back on the audience so that I can't tell if anyone's there or not, so no stress there at all.
Right. Everyone else has to look at
everybody else has to. Yeah, but it's like, you have this massive sound and this ability to hear all of these instruments and these parts doing things.
Yes.
But it's just, again, that whole idea that we need to set aside whatever we think from whatever we've seen in television or movies or even maybe our past experiences and realize that this is music telling stories.
Yeah.
And it's stories that are a little more complicated because your imagination is involved instead of the words being given to you. And there's nothing against vocal music. I love vocal music. But symphonic music forces you to be creative.
Oh, yeah.
Forces you to let that music wash through and over you and for you to decide what it means to you.
Yeah, everyone kind of comes up with their own story.
Yeah, they do.
I always enjoyed that. So, but I have a creative mind, so
exactly.
I enjoy those things.
Yeah,
so.
Good.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Sean Paul.
That title again.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to start charging people if they start using that.
You should. You really should. But yeah, this has been a pleasure.
Oh, for me too.
So, yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Sean Paul Mills. If you want to experience the magic of the Kankakee Valley Symphony Orchestra for yourself, be sure to check out their upcoming performances. I'll leave links in the show notes, of course. And thanks again to Sean Paul for joining me. And as always, thank you for listening to Kankakee Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, tell a friend. I'm Jake LaMore. Thank you so much for listening. Kankakee Podcast is made possible by Noble Dairy Queen Stores, Frank's Appliance Center and Sleep Source, Pigosh Engineering, King Music, Little Me's Studio, Taco John's, D. Westfall Jewelers, Edward Jones Financial Advisor Adam Elroy, Chicago Dough Company, KCC's Office of Continuing Education and Business Partnerships, and also our Patreon supporters like Teague Dreenan. Support the show for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Kankakee Podcast. Kankakee Podcast is a production of Pathfinder, a full-service marketing agency in downtown Kankakee. Learn more at yourpathfinder.io. Our theme song is by Lupe Carroll.
This river